Is China coming to the table or not?
Well, which table are you talking about? If they were coming into the ring to fight and take off the gloves and fight back, yes, they're going to be doing that. China has been fairly measured so far, and Xi Jinping essentially telling his government to remain calm until now. I think they had probably taken a little bit too many punches themselves, and finally 34% that takes effect on all U.S. goods imported into China on April 10th. So mid this week, there are a number of different export controls. They've added some defense companies to their so-called blacklist, the entity list. They are banning chicken imports from some American companies, sorghum from one American companies. Also, again, those rare earths, further restrictions on the outflow of rare earths, which China controls a large swath of them for the tech supply chain. You know, Danny was just talking about Apple. That is a good example of how these Trump tariffs do affect American companies who, after the first trade war with China, diversified to the so-called China Plus One strategy, going, Apple in particular, making, iPhones and Macs and other products in India, in Thailand, in Indonesia, Vietnam, and of course, Taiwan, a huge part of the tech supply chain, all of them getting sizable tariffs from the Trump administration. You have to watch what the markets are going to do today, because the markets here in Hong Kong and in China onshore were on holiday on Friday. They didn't take the brunt like the U.S. markets did on Friday.
Hello, fam. Back for a quick one. Today, I want to talk about the world of trade and economics and discuss this senseless ongoing tariff war with Donald Trump. So tariffs, basically, they're essentially taxes on imported goods. But here's the thing. They're paid by American businesses and individuals, not foreign producers. Think of it like this. When you buy a product from China or wherever, the tariff is added to the cost. And that's what now this is the important part, the consumer ends up paying. It's not like Chinese companies are footing the bill. Also, already this trade war has led to some serious market volatility. I mean, we've seen the S&P 500, NASDAQ, and the Dow Jones all take serious hits. And it's not just the markets. There are real concerns about a potential recession. For example, JP Morgan estimates a 60% chance of a global recession by the end of the year. That's a pretty significant risk, wouldn't you say? Trump's approach to tariffs is just ridiculous, though. I mean, it seems like he doesn't understand how they work, which is surprising to see from someone who has a bachelor degree in economics. Well, then again, maybe he had someone else take his test for him like he did with his SAT exam, because it's clear he missed some weeks out of school. Because he's always saying things like, we're going to stick it to them. But the reality is we're the ones paying the bill. And it's not just that. His tariffs are also hurting our relationships with key trading partners like Canada and Mexico.
And the author and Financial Times columnist, Gillian Tett. Well, welcome to all of you. Gillian, let me start with you as the presumptive financial brain of the panel. Put it in simple terms here. After all the conjecture, the rumor mills, the threats and so on, have we just ended up here with Trump saying it's going to be reciprocal tariffs across the board? And as a principle, actually, what is wrong with that?
Well, I think that Trump models his political style on the wrestling ring. Anyone who's been to a wrestling match in America knows there's a lot of manufactured aggro, dramatic moves, name calling, but often the audience knows that's partly manufactured because there'll then be some kind of, quasi-victory or a climb down. So what we're seeing right now is a lot of theatrics, a lot of drama. For him to describe this as reciprocal comes out of a theory amongst some of his advisors that after World War II, the US embarked on an uneven trade pattern to enable the rest of the world to develop quickly in the name of peace, and they think that's basically run past its sell-by date. Now, in some cases, they may be right, but imposing tariffs in this way is unlikely to rebalance trade in the way that Trump actually wants. It's unlikely to unleash this great big boom or economic boom that he talks about, is much more likely to unleash stagflation. Because the reality is today, the world trading system is so interconnected that taking this kind of unilateral move is highly likely to push up prices for American consumers as well as elsewhere in the world. And the sheer uncertainty and shock and the dismantling of these trade networks is almost certainly going to cause businesses to panic and for essentially economic activity to go down. So I suspect it's going to be quite painful for Americans like the rest of the world, at least in the short to medium term. And so, yes, it may work in the sense that Trump will be able to claim some short-term victories. However, the more likely reality is that almost every single company, every single country is now looking for alternatives and trying to look for ways to create alliances outside America. And global trade right now is rising quite rapidly, but mostly between countries that are not America rather than with America. So he's playing a very, very high stakes game. And of course, his bet is that the American public will endure the pain in the short term because he says in the medium to long term, it will reorientate the American economy. He's also betting, or at least Peter Navarro, his key advisor, is betting that tariffs will raise about $6 trillion worth of revenues over the next 10 years, and that will essentially help pay down the debt. But both of those are pretty unproven bets. And in the short to medium term, it's more likely that the rest of the world starts looking for alternatives rather than simply becomes a vassal state.
So you might ask me, why do I think this tariff war is going to be an epic fail? Well, other than Trump's buffoonish behavior, tariffs are, again, they're essentially a tax on the American consumer, and that will lead to higher prices and decreased economic activity. Plus, other countries are adapting to the new trade landscape, which could reduce their reliance on American goods, and that spells potential job losses and reduced economic growth. I would also like to add that countries like China and India have way more leverage than the United States would love to admit, because these countries could literally work their people into the ground for extremely cheap wages that would make the migrants here look like robber barons of the 19th century. In contrast, this is not happening in the modern America that we see, which gives those countries an evolutionary advantage from a capitalistic standpoint, especially when they have 1 billion more people that they can draw from or abuse. My question is, and I'm being honest here when I ask this question out of good faith, what makes Donald Trump believe these companies, industries, whatever, will come back to America when labor is typically the biggest controllable expense? Capitalism won't even allow that, because even if we overlook stubborn business leaders, people with egos like Trump, even if we overlook that they'll likely take years before those companies can move back, even if we overlook by the time they did come back, they could be facing a totally different president with completely different policies, even if the new president is a Republican. Those companies also would likely use AI and robotics, not this enormous, huge human American workforce of millions.
When I was there, I already see people holding their luggage, waiting in a long line in the factories. So I just step in the line and just wait. And then when it was my turn, they asked for my ID, and then they asked me to show my hands. So it's super easy. You don't have to apply, you don't have any skills, you just show up and then you get it.
President Donald Trump has talked about and said that he wants Apple to manufacture or bring its manufacturing partners into the United States to build iPhones. What do you think about that? Do you think it's something that US workers would do? What kind of conditions would have to change?
I think it's just the wages is unacceptable for American workers. So in the factories, I am actually getting paid by 3,100 yuan, so it's about $450 per month. I don't think American workers can accept that kind of wages based on the living conditions or the prices here. I would say that even though they really relocated the factories to the US, it will be replaced by robots. Because I do see a lot of stations on my assembly line actually done by robots already. So the station In front of me is a station that putting camera on the back case, and it's done by machine. And also the stations that put the battery on the case is also done by machine. And then, so you see that a lot of stations can actually done by machine, and it's very easy. My station is just putting one screw there. Like it totally can be done by machine. So why we are still using labors in China instead of machine is that it's like labor is even cheaper than maintaining the machines, I would say.
See, the United States, we're limited in that regard in scale and scope. In many ways, countries like India and China are more capitalistic in nature and care more about their bottom lines to the United States even if their people are dying at their workstations. For example, I once saw a documentary about China, and they had this factory where people slept in dormitories. They were often cramped together, 8 to 10 people per room. I think they were only allowed to get 5 hours of sleep a day. Their waking hours were also reserved for manual labor, only to get one bathroom or water break per 3 hours. They also had a system where they had cruel management that would also abuse them on the spot. In fact, this particular company wouldn't even allow them to leave, on top of making practically nothing. Now, this was a couple of years ago, and there were a few other Chinese companies that were also being investigated for human rights violations. Frankly, I don't know what came out of it, but I'm making a point here.
And 300,000 mostly young workers from the countryside live, sleep, and work here.
And this could be their first job away from home, right?
Most of them, this first job.
And a growing number of these workers are either killing themselves or trying to. And Foxconn doesn't know why. We've never seen anything like this before, says Liu Kun, the company spokesman. Workers spend long hours on the assembly line, not only supplying parts for Apple, but also for tech giants Dell, Hewlett-Packard and Nokia, earning less than $300 a month.
They have breakfast, they go to work, they work a solid shift, they come back to their dormitory, they sleep. It's a very dehumanizing place, and the workers are little more than the machines there.
Employees live in dormitories 8 to a room, common for factories in China. Often roommates, though, will not know each other's names.
Do you know these guys? Do you know their names? Do you know where they're from and all that kind of stuff?
She arrived 3 days ago. I don't know her name, she says.
There's no real sense of community there, and I think that is one of the significant factors behind this alarming number of suicides.
And Foxconn admits managers have been known to abuse workers if they make mistakes or miss deadlines.
4 Chinese toy factories were under investigation. A report by human rights watchdogs China Labor Watch, ActionAid, CIR, and Solidar Suisse shows the harrowing reality of labor conditions in Chinese toy factories. The campaign group sent undercover investigators to 4 major toy factories in Guangdong, China. The factories manufacture products for brands like Hasbro, Mattel, and Disney, as well as German manufacturers. The investigation uncovered a total of 23 severe rights violations. According to the report, workers at one of the factories live in unsanitary dorms, sharing a small single room with 8 to 10 people. Key findings reveal that factory workers put in 80 to 175 overtime hours per month. The Chinese Labor Department only allows for 36 overtime hours a month. In 3 of the 4 factories, workers were made to sign blank contracts without explanation. Workers did not receive copies of their own contracts. Workers also did not receive safety equipment as well as the legally required 24-hour safety training before starting work. This training is important as the workers handle toxic chemicals.
My take on this senseless tariff war is that Trump simply doesn't care, and it's all about his tough man persona. He and his immediate family is going to be all right. They're good, right? But he just expects the average American to take the hits for his ego. I mean, it's a complex issue, but I think it's clear that Donald Trump's approach is extremely flawed. I mean, as even Milton Friedman thought that tariffs were stupid. But if you aren't convinced, and that doesn't convince you, how about we get a few sage words from a darling of conservatism himself, Ronald Reagan.
My fellow Americans, Prime Minister Nakasone of Japan will be visiting me here at the White House next week. It's an important visit because while I expect to take up our relations with our good friend Japan, which overall remain excellent, recent disagreements between our two countries on the issue of trade will also be high on our agenda. As perhaps you've heard, last week I placed new duties on some Japanese products in response to Japan's inability to enforce their trade agreement with us on electronic devices called semiconductors. Now, imposing such tariffs or trade barriers and restrictions of any kind are steps that I am loath to take, and in a moment I'll mention the sound economic reasons for this, that over the long run such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer. But the Japanese semiconductors were a special case. We had clear evidence that Japanese companies were engaging in unfair trade practices that violated an agreement between Japan and the United States. We expect our trading partners to live up to their agreements. As I've often said, our commitment to free trade is also a commitment to fair trade. But you know, in imposing these tariffs, we were just trying to deal with a particular problem, not begin a trade war. So next week, I'll be giving Prime Minister Nakasone this same message. We want to continue to work cooperatively on trade problems and want very much to lift these trade restrictions as soon as evidence permits. We want to do this because we feel both Japan and the United States have an obligation to promote the prosperity and economic development that only free trade can bring. Now, that message of free trade is one I conveyed to Canada's leaders a few weeks ago, and it was warmly received there. Indeed, throughout the world, there's a growing realization that the way to prosperity for all nations is rejecting protectionist legislation and promoting fair and free competition. Now, there are sound historical reasons for this. For those of us who lived through the Great Depression, the memory of the suffering it caused is deep and searing. And today, many economic analysts and historians argue that high tariff legislation passed back in that period, called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, greatly deepened the Depression and prevented economic recovery. You see, at first, when someone says, let's impose tariffs on foreign imports, it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs. And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. What eventually occurs is, first, homegrown industries start relying on government protection in the form of high tariffs. They stop competing and stop making the innovative management and technological changes they need to succeed in world markets. And then, while all this is going on, something even worse occurs. High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. The result is more and more tariffs, higher and higher trade barriers, and less competition. So soon, because of the prices made artificially high by tariffs that subsidize inefficiency and poor management, people stop buying. Then the worst happens. Markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industries shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs. The memory of all this occurring back in the 30s made me determined when I came to Washington to spare the American people the protectionist legislation that destroys prosperity. Now, it hasn't always been easy. There are those in the Congress, just as there were back in the 30s, who want to go for the quick political advantage, who risk America's prosperity for the sake of a short-term appeal to some special interest group, who forget that more than 5 million American jobs are directly tied to the foreign export business, and additional millions are tied to imports. Well, I've never forgotten those jobs, and on trade issues, by and large, we've done well. In certain select cases, like the Japanese semiconductors, we've taken steps to stop unfair practices against American products, but we've still maintained our basic long-term commitment to free trade and economic growth. So, with my meeting with Prime Minister Nakasone and the Venice Economic Summit coming up, it's terribly important not to restrict a president's options in such trade dealings with foreign governments. Unfortunately, some in the Congress are trying to do exactly that. I'll keep you informed on this dangerous legislation because it's just another form of protectionism, and I may need your help to stop it. Remember, America's jobs and growth are at stake. Until next week, thanks for listening, and God bless you.